the Vesca Continuum had been watching Earth for nearly 400 years before they made their first mistake, and it was a small one, barely worth noticing at first. A single probe, no larger than a grain of sand, drifting through the upper atmosphere above the Pacific Ocean, sending back centuries of quiet observation to a civilization that had long ago decided humanity was not worth the risk of direct contact. The Vesca were patient in the way only a species that had outlived a dozen younger civilizations could be patient, and their conclusion about Earth reached generations before any human had split the atom or left the planet's gravity well, had always been the same. Humanity was violent, fractured, and self-destructive, a species seemingly incapable of going more than a decade without turning its own weapons on itself. They were, by every metric the Vesca Continuum used to judge emerging civilizations, not a threat worth acknowledging. They were a curiosity to be studied from a comfortable, silent distance, nothing more. That assumption held for 4 centuries, right up until the day the small probe drifting above the Pacific was struck by a piece of orbital debris and came crashing down into the collected wreckage of a decommissioned research station in the middle of the ocean. It should have burned up completely on re-entry. Instead, fragments of it survived, and those fragments were recovered 18 months later by a joint Sol compact salvage team searching the same waters for materials to repurpose in the construction of humanity's newest warship, a vessel that would eventually be named the Ares Requiem. Dr. Sarah Okafor was the lead xenotechnology analyst assigned to the recovered fragments, though at the time nobody involved in the salvage operation had any idea they were looking at alien technology at all. The pieces were strange, undeniably strange, composed of an alloy that defied every material science model available to human engineers, but strange had become almost routine in the years following humanity's first confirmed contact with the Cathir. It took nearly 6 months of careful analysis before Sarah's team confirmed what the fragments actually were. Not Cathir technology at all, but something else, entirely, something that had apparently been quietly observing Earth for far longer than either humanity or its new allies had suspected. The discovery sent a quiet tremor through the halls of the Sol Compact Council. But it was the deeper analysis, completed almost a year later, that truly shook the foundations of human confidence. Buried in the probe's damaged but partially recoverable memory core was a compressed archive of centuries of observational data, and woven through that archive was something that read less like scientific analysis, and more like a threat assessment, cold and clinical, cataloging every war humanity had ever fought, every weapon humanity had ever built, every moment in human history where violence had been chosen over compromise. And at the very end of that long, damning record was a single conclusion, translated painstakingly by the same linguistic algorithms that had once decoded the Cathir's mathematical greetings. This species was engineered for war, whether by nature or circumstance, and should be permitted to remain isolated and unaware for as long as possible, lest it ever discover the true scale of the galaxy, waiting beyond its own solar system. Chancellor Idris Okonkwo read the full translation twice before he called an emergency session of the council. And when he finally spoke to the assembled representatives, his voice carried a weight none of them had heard from him before, not even during the tense early hours of humanity's first contact with the Cathir, years earlier. "They've been watching us since before the Industrial Revolution," he said. "And their conclusion, reached centuries ago and apparently never revisited, is that we are too dangerous to approach, not too weak, too dangerous." General Vasquez, older now and more measured than he had been during those first frantic days of first contact, leaned forward with a grim expression. "If they've been watching this long and stayed hidden, then either they lost interest, or they were waiting for something. A single crashed probe doesn't feel like the end of centuries of caution, it feels like the beginning of something they didn't plan for." He was right, though it would take another 2 years before humanity understood exactly how right he had been. The Cathir, when finally consulted about the ancient probe and its damning archive, confirmed with visible unease that they knew of the Vesca Continuum, though not well. The Vesca were older than the Cathir by a margin measured in tens of thousands of years, A civilization that had long ago retreated from direct expansion, choosing instead to quietly monitor the galaxy from the shadows, intervening only when a species reached a threshold of technological capability that made it either useful as an ally or dangerous enough to require containment. No civilization the Cathar knew of had ever been formally classified in the second category, and survived the encounter unchanged. It was Dr. Okafor, buried in the recovered archive's final untranslated fragments, who found the detail that turned quiet unease into genuine alarm. The probe's final transmission, sent in the days before it was struck by orbital debris and lost, was not a routine data update. It was a request for direct intervention, flagged with an urgency marker, the Vesca Continuum, reserved for exactly one purpose: authorization to neutralize a species before it could become an active threat to Continuum interests. Humanity's recent, rapid expansion across the solar system, the construction of the Ares Requiem, and, above all, the newly formed alliance with the Cathar, had apparently been the final trigger the ancient Watchers had been waiting for. Somewhere out among the stars, a decision had already been made about humanity's fate, and the small crashed probe, the one accident in 4 centuries of perfect observation, was the only reason anyone on Earth had learned of it, at all. Commander Elena Voss, now a senior fleet admiral overseeing the expanding Titan-class warship program, was pulled into the crisis, within days of the translation's completion. 3 new Titan-class vessels had joined the Ares Requiem in the years since first contact, forming the backbone of a defense fleet humanity had built specifically in case its fragile new alliance with the Cathar ever drew the attention of something worse. Nobody, not even the most pessimistic voices on the council, had expected that something worse to have already been watching them for 400 years, quietly compiling evidence for humanity's own quiet erasure. "How long do we have?" Elena asked during the emergency briefing, and the Cathar liaison, a translator named Vesilathi, who had spent years learning to convey human speech patterns despite the profound alienness of her own species, answered with visible reluctance. "We don't know," she admitted. The probe's request for intervention was sent nearly 2 years ago, delayed only by the vast distances involved. If the Continuum approved the request immediately, a response fleet could already be en route. If they deliberated, as they often do given the gravity of such decisions, we may have more time. What we do know is that the Vesca Continuum does not send warnings. They do not offer the chance for a species to prove itself, as my people once offered you. When they decide a threat requires neutralization, they act with total, overwhelming force, once, and permanently. The weeks that followed were the most frantic in Sol Compact history, since the earliest days of the colonial uprising, centuries before. Every shipyard across human space was pressed into round-the-clock production, accelerating the construction of new Titan-class warships far beyond anything the fragile compact economy could comfortably sustain. The Cathar, bound by an alliance forged in blood and mathematics, years earlier, committed what forces they could spare, though even their liaisons admitted with quiet grief that a full Vesca intervention fleet would likely outmatch anything the combined strength of 2 young civilizations could muster. It was Dr. Okafor, working alongside Cathar researchers who had studied the Vesca from a cautious distance for millennia, who eventually proposed the plan that would come to define humanity's response. The ancient probe's own archive, damning as it was, contained something else buried within its centuries of cold observation: genuine confusion. The Vesca had spent 400 years watching humanity fight itself, again and again, and had concluded that violence was simply the species-defining, unchangeable nature. But the archive also contained fragments of more recent observation. The years following first contact with the Cathar, in which humanity had chosen restraint over aggression, not once but twice, first in the trembling hours before the Cathar's own approach, and again during the brutal Vorn Assembly's test of strength that had followed. The Vesca's threat assessment, Okafor argued, was outdated. Built on centuries of data that no longer reflected who humanity had actually become. "They think we're a war species," she told the assembled council, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was proposing. "And for most of our history, they weren't wrong. But we've had 2 chances now to prove otherwise, and we passed both tests. if we can get that more recent record in front of whoever makes the final decision on the Vesica side, we might not need to fight this war at all. We might be able to argue our way out of it. It was a desperate plan, and everyone in the chamber knew it, but as the weeks turned to months, and the expanded Titan-class fleet continued its uneasy vigil at the edge of the solar system, no better option presented itself. The Cathar agreed to carry a carefully compiled record of humanity's recent history toward the nearest known Vesica outpost. An ancient monitoring station, drifting in the dark between star systems, accompanied by Elena Voss herself, who insisted on making the journey in person, aboard a small diplomatic vessel, escorted by the newest Titan-class warship in the fleet. The journey took the better part of a year, and Elena spent much of it, rehearsing the argument she would make to a civilization that had never once, in its recorded history, reconsidered a threat classification once assigned. When the small delegation finally arrived at the edge of Vesica space, they found not a fleet prepared for annihilation, but a single ancient vessel, vast and silent, that had apparently been waiting, unmoving, for exactly this kind of approach. What followed was not a battle, but the longest and most consequential negotiation in human history, conducted across days of painstaking translation, as Elena Voss laid out, piece by piece, the story of a species that had indeed been built by circumstance and evolution for conflict, but had also, when finally given the chance to reach beyond its own world, chosen twice to set that violence aside. She spoke of the trembling council that had powered down its most dangerous warship rather than fire first. She spoke of the single duel fought, and won not out of bloodlust but out of desperate necessity, and the restraint shown afterward when victory could easily have become slaughter. She argued, with the full weight of humanity's fate resting on every word, that a species should be judged not by the wars it had once fought, but by the peace it chose to build once it finally had the power to choose. The Vesica's response, when it finally came, was neither a declaration of war, nor an easy absolution. It was, instead, a quiet and unprecedented reclassification, the first in the continuum's recorded history, moving humanity from the category of contained threat, to the far rarer, and more hopeful category of watched potential, one, a status the Cathar themselves had once held many thousands of years before. It was not forgiveness. It was a second chance, offered by a civilization that had never before believed. Second chances were worth the risk. Elena Voss returned to a soul compact, transformed by the knowledge of just how close humanity had come to being erased by a threat it never even knew existed, and the council, still trembling in the aftermath of everything they had learned, understood at last the fragile, terrifying truth the ancient probe had first revealed. Humanity had indeed been made for war, forged by millennia of conflict and struggle, long before it ever looked up at the stars. But it had also, in the brief and precious years since first contact, proven itself capable of something the Vesica continuum had never expected to witness. A species choosing, again and again, to become something more than the violence that had made it, standing now at the edge of a vast and watchful universe, determined to prove that the terrifying truth of its origins did not have to be the truth of its future. End story.